The bullies thought they could humiliate him. They had no idea he was a championship fighter. Sterling Hawthorne adjusted his glasses nervously as he walked through the hallways of Westbrook High School, his shoulders hunched forward in a futile attempt to make himself invisible. At 17, he stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a slight frame that seemed to swim in his oversized sweater. His dark hair fell across his forehead, partially obscuring the thick-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. To anyone who bothered to look, Sterling appeared to be exactly what he seemed, a quiet, bookish teenager who would rather spend his lunch period in the library than anywhere near the chaos of the cafeteria. Just make it through the day, Sterling thought to himself as he clutched his worn leather messenger bag closer to his chest. 3 more periods, and then I can go home. What none of his classmates at Westbrook High knew was that Sterling Hawthorne had been training in mixed martial arts since he was 8 years old. His father, Marcus Hawthorne, was a former professional fighter who now ran a small but respected MMA gym on the outskirts of town. Every morning before school and every evening after homework, Sterling transformed from the timid teenager his classmates saw into something entirely different, a disciplined fighter with lightning-fast reflexes and the kind of technical skill that had already earned him 3 state championship titles in youth divisions. But Sterling had made a promise to his father years ago, after an incident at his previous school had nearly resulted in serious injury to another student. "Your skills are not for settling scores or showing off," his father had said, his weathered face serious. "They're for protecting those who can't protect themselves, and only when there's absolutely no other choice. The moment you use your training for anything else, you dishonor everything I've taught you." So Sterling kept his secret, enduring the daily humiliations that came with being different in a place where conformity was everything. He had been at Westbrook for 3 months now, ever since his family moved to town, and he had quickly learned to navigate the social landscape by staying as invisible as possible. The trouble had started on his very first day, when he'd accidentally bumped into Derek Castellanos in the hallway. Derek was everything Sterling wasn't. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came from being the star quarterback of the football team. His perfectly styled brown hair and expensive clothes marked him as someone from one of the wealthy families that lived in the hills overlooking the town. Derek's entourage included Marcus Volkov, a hulking junior with arms like tree trunks who seemed to exist solely to laugh at Derek's jokes, and Tyler Reeves, a wiry kid with mean eyes who had the kind of cruel smile that suggested he enjoyed other people's pain. "Watch where you're going, freak," Derek had sneered that first day, shoving Sterling hard enough to send him stumbling into a row of lockers. The metallic clang had echoed through the hallway, and Sterling had felt dozens of eyes on him as he scrambled to collect his scattered books. "What are you, blind and stupid?" Sterling had mumbled an apology, his face burning with embarrassment, and hurried away while Derek and his friends laughed. It had been the beginning of what would become a daily ritual of torment. The cafeteria at Westbrook High was a battlefield disguised as a dining area, with its long rectangular tables arranged in invisible but clearly defined territories. Sterling usually found refuge at a small table in the far corner, where he could eat his lunch in relative peace while reading a book. On this particular Tuesday, Sterling was halfway through a turkey sandwich and deep into a chapter about ancient Roman military tactics when a shadow fell across his table. He looked up to find Derek Castellanos standing over him, flanked by Marcus and Tyler, all 3 wearing the kind of predatory grins that made Sterling's stomach clench with dread. "Well, well, well," Derek said, his voice carrying easily across the nearby tables. "If it isn't our favorite little bookworm. What fascinating literature are we absorbing today, Sterling?" The way Derek pronounced his name made it sound like an insult. Sterling carefully marked his place in the book and closed it, knowing from experience that any attempt to continue reading would only make things worse. "Just studying," Sterling said quietly, hoping his voice didn't betray the nervousness he felt. "Studying," Tyler repeated mockingly, his voice pitched high in a cruel imitation. "Hear that, guys? Sterling studying. What a surprise." Marcus reached over and plucked an apple from Sterling's lunch tray, taking a deliberately loud bite before making an exaggerated face of disgust. "Ugh, tastes like nerd," he said, dropping the half-eaten apple onto Sterling's open textbook. "Gross." "Don't react," Sterling told himself, the mental discipline his father had taught him kicking in. "It's just food. It's just words. They want a reaction." Before Sterling could respond, Tyler grabbed his messenger bag from the floor and upended it, sending books, notebooks, pens, and papers cascading across the cafeteria floor. The scattered contents of Sterling's academic life spread out like debris from a wreck, and the distinctive sound of paper fluttering to the ground seemed to echo in the sudden silence that had fallen over the nearby tables. "Oops," Tyler said with mock innocence. "Butterfingers." Sterling felt heat rise in his cheeks as he quickly dropped to his knees and began gathering his belongings. Around him, he could hear the whispered comments and barely suppressed laughter of his classmates. A few students had pulled out their phones, no doubt recording the humiliation for later entertainment. "This is not worth fighting over," he reminded himself as he crawled under tables to retrieve his scattered notes. Dad was right. This is not what my training is for. But as he reached for his history textbook, Derek's expensive sneaker came down hard on his fingers. The pain was sharp and immediate, causing Sterling to gasp and jerk his hand back. "Careful there, Sterling," Derek said with false concern. "These floors can be dangerous. You really should watch where you put your hands." The pattern continued for weeks. Derek and his friends seemed to have developed a sixth sense for finding Sterling at his most vulnerable moments. They would appear in empty hallways to shoulder-check him into lockers, knock books from his hands as he climbed stairs, or simply surround him and make comments designed to chip away at whatever confidence he might have had left. The worst incidents always seemed to happen in the gymnasium, during the mandatory physical education class that Sterling dreaded more than any other period. It was during a particularly brutal game of dodgeball that Derek and his friends had perfected their technique of making Sterling's life miserable while maintaining plausible deniability. But it was the small, constant humiliations that wore Sterling down the most. The way conversations would stop when he approached a group of classmates, the deliberate way other students would avoid sitting near him in classes where seating wasn't assigned, the cruel nicknames that seemed to follow him through the halls like invisible chains: sterile, sterling silver because he was apparently precious and delicate, and worst of all, ghost, because he was so pale and quiet that people joked he might not actually exist. "Why don't you just fight back?" a voice in Sterling's head would ask during the worst moments. "You could end this in seconds. One punch, properly thrown, and Derek would never bother you again." But Sterling knew it wasn't that simple. His father had taught him that true strength came from restraint, and that the decision to use violence had to be weighed against all other options. So Sterling endured day after day, telling himself that high school was temporary and that maintaining his principles was more important than his pride. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in November, nearly 4 months after Sterling had first walked through the doors of Westbrook High. He had been having an unusually good day. He'd received an A+ on a history paper, managed to eat lunch without incident, and was looking forward to getting home early because his last period teacher had called in sick. Sterling was washing his hands in the second-floor bathroom, one of the smaller, less frequently used restrooms near the art wing, when he heard footsteps behind him. He glanced up at the mirror and felt his stomach drop as he saw Derek, Marcus, and Tyler filing into the bathroom behind him, their expressions carrying a particular kind of malicious anticipation that Sterling had learned to recognize. "Well, well," Derek said, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "Look who we found. All alone, too. How convenient." Sterling turned around slowly, his back against the sink, and tried to keep his voice steady. "I don't want any trouble, Derek." "Trouble?" Derek laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Who said anything about trouble? We just want to have a little chat, right, guys?" Marcus and Tyler moved to flank Sterling, effectively blocking his path to the door. Sterling's heart was pounding now, but not with fear, with something much more dangerous. He could feel the familiar sensation of his body beginning to shift into the state his father had trained him to recognize, the heightened awareness and controlled tension that preceded action. "Not yet," he told himself firmly. "There has to be another way." "You know what your problem is, Sterling," Derek continued, beginning to pace back and forth in the small space like a predator sizing up its prey. "You think you're better than us. You think because you get good grades and read your little books, that makes you special. Look," Sterling said, trying to inject some authority into his voice, "I don't know what you think I've done to you, but nothing," Derek interrupted, taking a step closer. "You exist. That's what you've done to me. You walk around this school like a ghost, never talking to anybody, never participating in anything, acting like you're too good for the rest of us, and frankly, I'm sick of it." "So we thought we'd help you become a little more social," Marcus added, cracking his knuckles with deliberate menace. Derek's smile was cold and calculating. "We want you to learn some respect, and we're going to teach it to you." What happened next unfolded with a terrible, inevitable momentum. Derek nodded to Marcus, who grabbed Sterling's arms and pinned them behind his back with casual ease. Sterling could have broken the hold. He knew at least 3 different techniques that would have freed him instantly, but some part of him was still hoping this was just another humiliation that he could endure and walk away from. "You know," Derek said conversationally, "I've been thinking about what would really get through to you, what would make you understand your place here." Tyler had moved to the row of bathroom stalls and was pushing open doors, apparently looking for something. "This one's perfect," he called out, his voice bright with excitement. "Nice and clean." Sterling felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand what they had planned. "Don't," he said, his voice carrying a warning that none of them seemed to notice. "Don't what?" Derek asked with mock innocence. "We're just going to help you wash your hair. Get some of that greasy nerd smell out of it." Marcus began dragging Sterling toward the stall Tyler had selected, and Sterling felt something fundamental shift inside him. The careful control his father had taught him, the principles he had held on to despite months of abuse, began to crack under the weight of what was about to happen. "This is different," a voice in his head said. "This isn't just humiliation. This is assault." "Derek," Sterling said, his voice carrying a note of authority that hadn't been there before, "you need to stop this right now." But Derek wasn't listening. They forced Sterling to his knees in front of the toilet bowl, and Marcus pressed down on his shoulders while Tyler grabbed a handful of his hair. The porcelain was cold against Sterling's knees, and he could smell the harsh chemical scent of industrial cleaning supplies. "Any last words, Ghost?" Derek taunted, clearly enjoying what he saw as his moment of complete victory. That's when Sterling felt something snap inside him, like a wire that had been pulled too tight for too long. The months of endured humiliation, the constant fear, the daily grind of being treated as less than human, all of it crystallized into a moment of perfect, cold clarity. Enough. The transformation was instantaneous. Years of training took over as Sterling's body shifted from victim to weapon in the space of a heartbeat. He drove his elbow backward into Marcus's solar plexus with surgical precision, hitting the exact spot that would cause maximum incapacitation with minimum lasting damage. Marcus doubled over with a strangled gasp, his grip on Sterling's shoulders vanishing as he struggled to breathe. Sterling spun to his feet with fluid grace, his glasses somehow still in place despite the sudden movement. Tyler, still holding a handful of Sterling's hair, found himself face to face with someone completely different from the quiet boy they had been tormenting. Sterling's first punch caught Tyler in the center of his chest, a short, sharp blow that lifted the smaller boy off his feet and sent him crashing into the metal partition between stalls. The sound was tremendous in the confined space, and Tyler crumpled to the floor with a look of complete shock on his face. Derek, who had been watching with smug satisfaction just moments before, suddenly found himself alone with someone who moved like violence incarnate. Sterling didn't look angry. That was perhaps the most terrifying thing about the transformation. He looked calm, focused, like someone solving a mathematical equation. "Sterling," Derek said, his voice cracking slightly. "Let's just—" Sterling's response was swift and decisive. He closed the distance between them in 2 smooth steps and grabbed Derek by the front of his expensive shirt, lifting him slightly off the ground with surprising ease. Derek, who had never been in a real fight in his life, suddenly understood that he was completely outmatched. "You wanted to give me a royal treatment," Sterling said quietly, his voice steady and controlled. "Let me return the favor." What followed was not the chaotic brawl that most high school fights devolved into. Sterling moved with the calculated precision of someone who had trained for thousands of hours, each movement economical and purposeful. He didn't waste energy on flashy techniques or unnecessary brutality. He simply neutralized the threats in front of him with the minimum force required. Derek found himself on the receiving end of a series of quick, sharp strikes that left him dazed and disoriented. Sterling targeted nerve clusters and pressure points, techniques that would cause intense pain and temporary paralysis without inflicting permanent damage. Within 30 seconds, Derek was on the floor next to his friends, all 3 of them looking up at Sterling with expressions of complete bewilderment. Sterling straightened his sweater and pushed his glasses up his nose, transforming back into the quiet, unassuming student his classmates thought they knew. But there was something different now. A confidence in his posture, a steadiness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "Here's how this is going to work," Sterling said, his voice carrying quiet authority as he looked down at the 3 boys on the bathroom floor. "This ends now, all of it. The comments, the pushing, the little games in PE class. You're going to leave me alone, and you're going to leave everyone else alone too." Marcus was still struggling to breathe properly, but he managed to gasp out, You're crazy." Sterling crouched down so he was at eye level with Derek, who was cradling what would probably be a spectacular bruise on his ribs. "No," Sterling said calmly. "I'm trained. There's a difference. My father owns Hawthorne's MMA gym on Industrial Boulevard. I've been fighting competitively since I was 8 years old. I have 3 state championship titles, and I've been holding back for 4 months because I thought it was the right thing to do." The 3 bullies stared at him in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this revelation with the quiet, bookish boy they thought they had known. "But you," Sterling continued, his gaze fixed on Derek, "you decided to cross a line today. You decided that humiliating me wasn't enough. You wanted to degrade me, to break something inside me that can't be fixed with an apology. So I'm done holding back." The bathroom door opened, and several students who had heard the commotion began to file in, their expressions ranging from curious to shocked as they took in the scene. Sterling recognized a few of them, quiet kids like himself who had probably been victims of Derek's group at one point or another. "What happened?" asked Jenny Martinez, a junior who had always been kind to Sterling in the few interactions they'd had. "Nothing much," Sterling said with a slight smile. "Just a misunderstanding that got cleared up." Derek struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage. "This isn't over," he snarled, but there was no conviction behind the words. The threat sounded hollow, even to him. Sterling turned to face him directly, and for a moment Derek saw something in the quiet boy's eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. "Yes," Sterling said quietly, "it is." The news of what had happened in the second-floor bathroom spread through Westbrook High with the speed that only high school gossip could achieve. By the time Sterling made it to his locker at the end of the day, half the school had heard some version of the story, and the details had grown increasingly dramatic with each retelling. The changes were immediate and profound. Students who had never given Sterling a second glance suddenly found reasons to strike up conversations with him. Teachers who had dismissed him as just another quiet kid began to see him differently. But perhaps the most significant change was in Derek and his friends. The cocky swagger that had defined their interactions with other students was gone, replaced by a nervous awareness that their actions had consequences. The most unexpected change came in the form of other students approaching Sterling with their own stories. Jenny Martinez was the first, catching up with him after history class to quietly thank him for what he had done. "They've been picking on my little brother for weeks," she confided. "Ever since what happened with you, they've left him alone." Similar stories followed throughout the week. A freshman named David told Sterling that Derek's group had been demanding his lunch money every day until news of the bathroom incident spread. A quiet senior named Rebecca admitted that Tyler had been making inappropriate comments about her appearance for months, but had suddenly become respectful and distant. Sterling began to understand that his confrontation with Derek hadn't just been about his own dignity. It had been about breaking a cycle of intimidation that had affected dozens of students who had felt too powerless to resist. The administration called Sterling to the principal's office the following Monday, where he sat across from Principal Hughes, a stern woman in her 50s, who had the unfortunate job of maintaining order in a school full of teenagers. "The interesting thing is, Mr. Hawthorne," she said after reviewing the incident reports, "that despite having 3 separate accounts of what happened, I'm having trouble determining exactly who was at fault." Sterling waited, knowing that anything he said could potentially make the situation worse. "It seems that there were witnesses who observed Mr. Castellanos and his friends following you into that bathroom with what one student described as obvious, malicious intent. There are also several students who have reported a pattern of harassment directed toward you over the past several months." Sterling remained silent, but he felt a small surge of gratitude toward his classmates who had apparently decided to tell the truth. "Here's what's going to happen," Principal Hughes said, closing the file. "You're going to serve 1 day of in-school suspension for fighting on school property. Mr. Castellanos and his friends are going to serve 3 days of suspension and are going to be placed on disciplinary probation for the remainder of the semester." Sterling nodded, accepting the consequences without complaint. "However," the principal continued, "I want to be very clear about something, Mr. Hawthorne. While I understand that you were defending yourself, I cannot have students settling disputes with violence in my school. If something like this happens again, the consequences will be much more severe." "I understand, ma'am," Sterling said. "It won't happen again." As Sterling left the principal's office, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. The hallways that had once felt like minefields now seemed navigable. Students who had previously avoided him now nodded respectfully when they passed. But perhaps the most important change was internal. Sterling no longer felt the need to make himself invisible. The final confrontation came 2 weeks later in the cafeteria during lunch period. Sterling was sitting with a small group of students who had gravitated toward him when Derek approached their table. Sterling looked up calmly as his former tormentor stood beside his chair, clearly struggling with some internal conflict. Derek's expensive clothes and perfect hair were still intact, but there was something diminished about him. "Sterling," Derek said quietly, his voice lacking any of the swagger it had once carried. "Derek," Sterling replied neutrally. The cafeteria seemed to hold its breath as students at nearby tables turned to watch the interaction. Derek glanced around nervously, then looked back at Sterling. I wanted to say something to you." Sterling waited, giving Derek the space to say whatever he had come to say. "What we did to you," Derek continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was wrong, all of it. The things we said, the way we treated you. It was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, sincere in its awkwardness. Sterling could see that it had cost Derek something to deliver it. "I accept your apology," Sterling said simply. Derek nodded, looking both relieved and uncertain. "I know I don't have any right to ask this, but are we okay?" Sterling considered the question carefully. Derek had spent months making his life miserable, but Sterling also understood that people were capable of change. "We're okay," Sterling said finally. "But Derek." "Yeah? This is who I've always been. The only thing that changed is that I stopped hiding it. Remember that the next time you think about picking on someone who seems like an easy target." Derek nodded vigorously. "I will. I'll remember, and I won't. I'm done with all that stuff." "Good," Sterling said, and meant it. As Derek walked away, Sterling felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The cycle of abuse that had defined his first months at Westbrook High was finally broken. When spring came, Sterling realized that Westbrook High no longer felt like a place he needed to survive. It had become simply a place where he went to school. On the last day of classes, as Sterling cleaned out his locker, he reflected on everything that had happened since that terrible Thursday in November. He had learned that strength without compassion was mere brutality, but that compassion without the ability to defend it was ultimately powerless. He had discovered that sometimes the most important battles were the ones you tried hardest to avoid, and that standing up for yourself didn't require you to tear others down. Most importantly, he had learned that being true to yourself, all of yourself, including the parts that others might find surprising, was not something to be ashamed of, but something to be proud of. As Sterling walked out of Westbrook High for the last time that year, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced his demons and emerged victorious. The bullies had thought they could break him, but instead, they had inadvertently helped him discover his own strength, and in the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all.